Hello, my name is Robert Bradford, and for my research presentation, I chose to examine a textual analysis essay on Mary Shelley's The Last Man. The essay, entitled Her Whole Soul Was Ear, Novel Sound, Experimental Music, and Artistic Community in Mary Shelley's Last Man, was written by Zachary Tooman, an instructor of rhetoric, composition, and literature at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. The essay acts as a critical analysis of Shelley's The Last Man, with particular emphasis placed on the use of sound and music throughout the novel. Tooman attempts to argue that Shelley incorporates a language of sound and music into The Last Man to amplify the intellectual and emotional resonance of the novel. Tooman starts the essay with a bit of historical background, and I've created a timeline that incorporates some of the major dates he discusses. We begin in 1816, also known as the Year Without a Summer, in which a devastating volcanic eruption created disastrous ecological effects throughout Europe and Asia, greatly influencing the framing of Shelley's novel. Next, we move to the death of Shelley's husband, Percy Shelley, in July of 1822, beginning a period of personal devastation in Mary Shelley's life. Tooman also touches on a journal entry of Shelley's soon after her husband's death, in which she discusses her relationship with her dead husband and her still living mentor, Lord Byron. Finally, we have the original publication of The Last Man in 1826, which Tooman notes is the only publication of the novel that Shelley was actually directly involved with. To begin his argument, Tooman describes his interpretation of how Shelley uses sound and music as a theme in The Last Man. He describes Shelley's use of music as an interpretive key to understanding the novel, as a tool for relating the confined feelings of characters and revealing deeper meaning, and thus communicating truth. He references Shelley's own diary entry in which he associates sound as a key aspect of memory and presence. Shelley writes, "I would endure ages of pain to hear one tone of your voice strike on my ear." He argues that to Shelley, sound signifies presence, while silence is representative of absence. He relates these ideas to Shelley's real-life exposure with what we'll call her musical mentors, contemporary writers and musicians that would have greatly influenced Shelley around the time of her writing The Last Man. As we have already discussed, Tooman sees Shelley's close relationship with Lord Byron in his writings to be a great influence on the way in which she uses the themes of sound and music in her own writings. Shelley also spent time with composer Vincent Novello around the time of her writing The Last Man, and describes him as being influential in her understanding of not only the way music is written, but basic concepts and the ways to incorporate musicality into her writings. Shelley was also influenced by the writer and poet Leigh Hunt. Hunt, the founder and collaborator of a literary journal, would have no doubt introduced Shelley to literature and sheet music that was often printed in literary magazines at the time. Finally, Shelley no doubt took cues from her own husband's musical musings before beginning The Last Man. At this point, Tooman shifts to discussing textual examples of ways in which Shelley incorporates sonic themes into The Last Man. He examines the structure of the novel, taking specific aim at the introduction and its close relation to a musical overture, which acts as an opening or introduction to a musical work and often contains themes from that body of work or otherwise indicates the character of the work, a piece of varying form and dimension. Shelley's frame story of a Sibylline prophecy acts as a foreboding warning of the destruction to come, setting both the scene and the tone of the three-volume novel. A structural feature which Tooman also argues was purposeful, in that each volume acts as a movement for Shelley's larger score. Each volume operates as a principal division of the larger work, all having differing tempos from each other, the first operating as a peaceful setup, the second as rising action, and the third as the outcome of the apocalypse. In the 1826 publication, the only publication in which Shelley was directly involved in, also included 2 chapter 4s relating to a common musical time signature of 4x4, designating an overall speed and progression of the piece. Tooman's most compelling evidence, however, comes from his textual analysis of Shelley's characters. He presents Shelley as characterizing individuals as instruments, using musical metaphors and language to depict personalities and relate interpersonal relationships. When Lionel first meets Adrian, he describes his thrilling voice like sweet melody, awake, a mute echo within me, stirring to its depths the lifeblood in my frame. And of his encounter with Raymond in the House of Politicians, he describes softly melodies that came like the mild breathing of a flute after a loud organ-like voice of his adversary. Tooman makes the comparisons between Adrian and Raymond as sonic enchanters and charmers, describing them as adept musicians that possess the interpersonal musical power to persuade and invite. I would agree in that the musicality in these quotes can often be found in the other characters' interpersonal dialogue and affects the way they seem to interact with each other, and thus affects the meaning related to the reader. Finally, Tooman concludes his essay by re-emphasizing the ways in which Shelley unites the language of narrative with the language of written music through her structural and textual deployments. In my opinion, all Romantic writing seems to have some musicality to it, but after reading Tooman's essay, I was convinced that Shelley must have had musical themes on her mind before writing The Last Man. In her own words, she saw music as a way for new ideas to rise and develop themselves. I also found it interesting exploring how Shelley was personally influenced by music through her close friends at the time of her writing The Last Man. In the creation of the score of The Last Man, I would agree that Shelley uses musical themes as an instrument to invoke greater emotion and create lasting resonance with the reader.